Alright, everyone. Lego is back again from a bit of an absence in postings lately because I've been focusing on this, which is probably my biggest project to date, public or otherwise. It's not longer than anything else I've done. In fact, I'd say this is far from the longest piece of text I've ever made. But the complexity here is this time I tried a bunch of new techniques and a new set of scripts as well. So the hope was with this piece that I would try to blend together a lot of different scripts in a different way than I'd previously done in the Courage to Set Sail project, which was my previously biggest mix of scripts. But they were just like put in there at random wherever there was space. They didn't cohere to each other at any point. They were just there to be there. So this time I'm scripting out a song. It's no secret. It's on the right. It's literally on there on screen right now. So this is the lyrics for the song called Ashes. And the idea here was to make every word, every verse in Shermans, but then take the chorus, the repeating part, and make that in a different script each time. Both so, it doesn't look so tedious and I mean, it doesn't look the same, but still it is kind of samey. Mixing different scripts would certainly mix up the visuals and create some interesting differences across the page. So that was the primary reason I wanted to try and tackle the fact that you can make songs look not repeating. And the other thing was I just really wanted to do some more mixed script. So what you're seeing me do right now, and what you'll see me do a lot of, is I will start off writing the 3 lines of Sherman, and I'll use proto-text to do that. So I'll write the raw shapes, and then I will sort of remember where everything is, and by the clues of the placement of the letters, I'll have an idea of what everything says. Then I'll switch to a specific script and write out the repeating part in that script. And this will go on for several rounds. There are 6 verses and a bunch of repeating text. So what you're seeing me do so far is make a bit of a planning session, as you see right here. Now that I've made one verse, I'm trying to figure out if this format is going to carry on throughout the rest, or if I need to change anything, because now I have a sense of scale, I have a sense of structure, and I have a bit of an understanding of the framework that I have to work with in regards to the special scripts, because they're not going to be so easily contained as Shermans. Very few of them are as compact, to put it bluntly. So I started off with the first verse. I made that in GC, which is very dear to me, and that's probably the most compact to start with. So I started off conservative. I can't speak. I started off with the easy script, and then I worked my way sort of towards the more complex, more scattered systems later on. Not particularly by planning on doing that, but it just sort of happened that way. So this is a big project, and therefore there is going to be a lot of color coding. You'll see colors all over the place when I do the proto writing here, because I need to remember and sort of keep track of what cuts into what, and what is affected by what. So I'm going to do a lot of that, and it's going to look very dizzy. And this video is in fact very dizzy because this is sped up by 30 times. So it is a lot more than 99% of my projects in that regard. So it is very fast here, and I'm trying to keep everything going here with some intelligent commentary, but if I were to stop the video, I would probably have even more things to say about each part, because there's just a lot going on here. What you're seeing right now, for instance, is me trying my very first time of doing time rotor. So I made a script, not a script, I made a quick guide on the right there, as I do for most of the scripts that I'm not fluent in. And then first off, I had to sit down and understand the premise and understand the different abstract aspects of this, because this is the most abstract script I've ever seen that actually works. So I had to sit down and figure out the rules. I had to sit down and figure out which of the rules that don't work in reality, because it's one thing for a guide to say something, but when that guide doesn't give you examples, you sort of have to figure out what they mean and whether or not that is actually realistically possible or not. And especially one mechanic in this script didn't really make a lot of sense. It didn't really seem feasible, and it didn't seem like the creator actually adhered to it in the very brief examples given in that guide. So I ended up having to figure out something else for that. But that's a more technical explanation for another day. It doesn't really have any bearing on just what you're seeing here. It's just I needed to figure out some underlying concepts for that script for it to work out if I ever have to use it again. Because frankly, I'm not sure I'm going to be using that with any frequency, because it is just so weird to get your head around. Now, moving on, we are at the third verse now. So I'm just speeding through the Sherman here in short order. I made this project across about 4 months. So there's been a lot of work on this, and then I have been distracted by other works, other projects I've made. Anything I've published in the last 3 months or so has probably been while I was taking a break from this. So my style of writing has changed, I think, visibly through this project alone, just because of how long this spans. So even though I don't intentionally change anything about the workflow here, it's just been going on for so long that I might have changed my routines a little bit during the project's time. So there's that to consider. And then I also have to dust off some scripts that I don't use that often, or I use in another context, because a big problem, or at least a significant, what's the word? A major decision for me when deciding which scripts to use was, one, what do I have the space for? Because I need to try and miniaturize as much of this as possible. There's not a lot of space to work with given the constraints that I've set myself. And even though everything is vectorized, so you can scale everything up and down infinitely, some of the scripts have inherent size barriers in place in order to be able to interpret certain characters correctly. So even though I can scale up and down all I want, I still have the internal scales that need to fit with each other in order for everything to read properly. So miniaturization was a big part of it. Can I miniaturize this or can I not? Which is why a fantastic script like TARDIS Console and Rassilonian is not part of this, because they're pretty much impossible to scale down. You can't just take these complex symbols and make them small. So that's a consideration. And the second consideration I also had was, is this going to be fitting for the project at hand? So I have some really cool scripts, but they won't necessarily be good for a project like this, because there's so many repeating patterns, there's so many layers of scale. So you have words inside sentences, inside verses, inside songs. So you have this hierarchy of different and some scripts are just better at working with that than others. I think it's the best way I can put it, just real quick. Now, we skipped a couple of stuff here. You saw me briefly earlier doing some Clockwork. I like Clockwork. It's a nice script. Now we're on to Doctor's Cut. And if everything is too fast for you, especially Doctor's Cut, because the Doctor's Cut formula is spread across so many pages, so you have to pan back and forth and back and forth. It is dizzy. It's dizzying trying to look at the Doctor's Cut script in progress, especially when you have the guide on screen like I do, because you need to go back and forth a lot. It's not very, it's not a compact guide, shall we say. But here we are doing some Doctor's Cut, and I every time I read Doctor's Cut, it's a long journey, but every time I write it, it goes surprisingly fast, and I get surprised every time by how nice it is to actually just write and construct the sounds and the sentences. It's really nice to do. The downside is I don't really like the post-processing of Doctor's Cut. It's one of the worst post-processes that I have currently, and I'm sure there's a way to make the workflow better. I just haven't gotten to that point where I've used it enough to find a good workflow that actually accomplishes what I want quickly. Because writing the individual sounds is easy, but once you come down to assembly and you have to construct the words and the sentences, there's a lot of overlap inherent in this system. The architecture is set up to have a lot of shapes partially overlapping other shapes, and the way I found to deal with that is simply by cutting away the pieces I don't need, because I need to do color work. If you were just doing black and white, there's a lot more options available, but because I know I need and want to do color work and adjust the pairs, and I need to have certain options available to me, I need to do clean paths on everything. So that takes an awful lot of time compared to writing, and it always annoys me, and it reminds me of why I don't do more Doctor's Cut, frankly. Having said that, you're seeing me assemble the actual letters right now, cutting away the stuff that needs to be cut, making the actual sentence, and figuring out the composition of how I want those to flow. You can see I made a red area up above. That is the available area I expect to have at hand to actually fit this text in. So I need to miniaturize as best I can. I need to figure out how I want everything to look, and then I need to figure out some flow which enables me to have that text fit into the space that I have. And it is going to take a little bit of finagling to make that flow, because there's no orientation markers in this script. So I need to have a logical flow from A to B without it being too obvious or too confusing. If everything's going too fast, just remember that I'm going to go through every script at least twice more in this video, because this is just the raw text. Once I'm done with that, I'm gonna have to go through every script again, both to proofread and also because it's probably been 2 months at this point since I started out. So I'm going to inevitably have to look at everything again and just take a second impression and look if everything seems all right. So I'm going to go through everything once again, and once I'm through with that, I'm going to finalize every piece of writing, and then I'm going to proofread for a second time, because, well, I know now because I've been through it, but I caught a bunch of stuff, way more than I usually get for a project this size. I'm positive I've just been way more distracted using these new scripts to pay proper attention. So this project was more distracting than usual, so I'm going to be more vigilant in my proofreading, which I've hopefully gone right. Now we're back at CC, which is a nice little script, and I think at this point in CC, I have gotten the workflow down to a T. It is about as quick and efficient as I can make it. I started out having big problems with line modifiers and cutting those off at the right points and keeping track of those points. I've since gotten way better at making those in an order that makes sense to avoid possible spelling errors. So I'm really happy with that. It means that I have no fear of making any spelling mistakes. It's practically, I won't say it's idiot proof, but it is very hard at this stage to make spelling mistakes in this, as long as you just go letter by letter and just look at it once, and that's it. You don't have to go back and revisit it later, even though I did. So it's a nice simple script, and it's also really fascinating to look at different systems, because essentially what I'm saying is the same sentence over and over again, and yet the scripts take up very different amounts of space. Some are more compact than others, and this is more evident the longer we go on here, because things like Doctor's Cut and CC just take up a lot of space, because you can't nest them in the same way that you could nest GC or Shermans or Rassilonian. They don't really lean that way, as it were. But I'm taking up pretty much all the space here on the left, so I'm pretty happy with that, because empty areas in Gallifreyan is just, I mean, there's so many ways you can deal with it, so why have an empty area? So at this point, I think we've reached the 5th verse, or the 6th. No, it's 6th. It's the last verse. We're down to the last verse, and at this point, about 3 months at least has had to have happened. For anyone who's curious, the actual time that I spent on this is probably closer to 24 hours of actual writing, and then there's some post-processing and some video editing, minimal editing, stuff like that. So all in all, probably 26, 27 hours. But if I were to actually sit down and just look at the time it took me to make the project instead of publishing it, that would be 24 hours. So that's exactly the same, pretty much exactly the same as my Striking 12s project, which is officially the biggest project I've ever made. So it's humbling to think of the comparison here, because there's far less text here, but it took approximately the same time, just because it was so much more complex to fit together and make. Plus, I had to make up a new skill set at least twice. One of the times was for Time Rotor, and the other is what you're seeing right now, which is probably the newest Gallifreyan system to arrive on scene, at least at the time of making this video, which is something called Spinner Gallifreyan. And it was inspired by Timekeepers, which was inspired by CC, which we saw earlier, so that's why they look pretty similar. What I'm doing here is similar to Doctor's Cut. I'm making up every word, and then later I need to assemble them in some way. And that's what you're seeing me do right now. This is circular, so I have a lot of opportunities for compactness, but this system is also sort of leaning towards the idea of meshing the different pieces together. So instead of just merely overlapping, there is opportunities here to mesh the different lines together. And I tried to lean into that a bit, but that comes later when we actually do the cutting, which is what we're doing now. So I'm waiting to make the centerpiece later. I have an idea that I want some Grubbifreyan 2 in the center because of its many wonderful properties for filling out space. At this stage, I have a wild idea of making some Grubbifreyan and then branching that text out, pun intended, to fill up some of the empty space out in the outer edges of the song so that I sort of organically fill out that space without just putting a bunch of empty, meaningless lines or patterns just to take up that space. If I can get the text out there, it would probably look better. At least that's what my thinking process is at this stage. So similar to Doctor's Cut and some of the other projects that overlap, like Rassilonian, at this point I'm cutting the raw text, including the GC and the time rotor and the Shermans, of course. So you're seeing a lot of the color disappear here as I go along and remember and reread and figure out which part need to cut what. And it's helped along a lot by the color coding, but it's not perfect because I think it changed the color code meanings at least once during the project's lifetime. So, but that's a problem for me. And sometimes new color codes come into play because even though Time Rotor is being cut right now into final shape, the actual layout and the methodology of the script means that I need to go through it twice more, once to cut it and once to determine the shapes of the letters relative to the arcs they rest on, because different sized letters need different sized cuts, if that makes sense, because of the way the phonetics are distinguished in that system. It's pretty annoying because it makes it way harder to write, but it does make it 10 times easier to read. So that's the trade-off there. It's actually very easy to read Time Rotor once you have the underlying abstract ideas of how you create verbs and tenses, but it is a pain to write for the same reason. So there's that. Now we have arrived at Doctor's Cut, and now comes the bane of my existence, which was the actual creation, or rather destruction, of the boundaries to make the actual composition of the words. So until now, I just bunched them together and made a boundary for how much each letter was going to take up in red, but I didn't actually cut it. So now comes the tedious part of actually using those meshed letters and create the illusion that they're actually overlapping while maintaining the paths that I need to do the color work for later. So this is the only reason I don't use Doctor's Cut more, is because this post-processing is really time intensive relative to the scale of the text itself. Even a small text, like a single sentence like this, it just takes longer than it probably ought to take. And I'm sure there's some cool trick somewhere in the book that can make this faster. Maybe in the 1.3 I can use the flatten feature to do some sort of something there. But at this point I haven't used it enough to really get a good flow. And even if I did, there's too long between different projects that my skills would probably be rusty again, which is a common problem actually. If you have too many skills, sorry, not too many options, you can't utilize them all the same, and some scripts are just gonna have to be left less used than others. Now, Spinner, the new kid of the block, is quite interesting here. I'm trying to weave the different lines together in a sort of wave formation, and I'm pretty pleased with the end result. But at this point, I'm just trying to connect different circles up so that they have some tangent lines that would create the illusion of going from one circle to another. And that's what I'm trying to do right now. And then I made the idea of the Celtic knot effect, try and figure out the parameters for how that would affect so many lines at once. And after doing some screening and taking some backups, I attempted to make one big weaving effect for all of the lines at once. There's a lot of overlapping lines here, and I did not cut everything according to plan at all. I had to do a bunch of post adjustments when I got to them later on. But for now, at first, I tried to make everything overlap in a sensible way, and having done that at first, I now had to do the line work. Now, the line work for this script is possibly even more annoying than Shermans, which sounds like an insult, but it's not. It's just like it's just like Shermans in that lines matter a lot, and you just have to do your best to make those lines interesting, because this script has a lot of lines. So that was just something I had to deal with. You have a bit less creative freedom in where those lines end up, not because you can't do the same things with those lines as you could in Sherman. It's just that by the nature of how I put everything together, I had a lot less space to play with. If you made a less compact version of that same sentence, you could do a lot more interesting things with the lines. But that's just a consequence of what I ended up doing. Um, Lines in general is the thing I'm doing right now. I've cut everything up. This is the third round around the text. So we did the raw text, now we did the cutting, and at this point we are at the line stages. Different systems require different amount of lines, and they require them in different ways. I did my best to try throughout this project to connect the necessary lines between different scripts, just to bind everything a little bit closer together and make everything more coherent. And I think I succeeded in that. Especially Time Rotor and CC don't really need lines all that much, so they feel a little bit left out. But otherwise, most of the scripts here do need lines in some amount, and I did my best to at least make some external references back and forth to really sell the idea that this is one piece of text. And yeah, we're just going through a lot of that right now. It's always fun to put dots down. I think more scripts need dots, but that's probably just me. Now, at this point, what I am starting to think about a little bit is the empty spaces in the sentence circles. Not necessarily the word circles themselves, but there was not, and there was never intended to be, a lot of overlap between the sentence circles. So the different verses were never meant to overlap. I've done that previously in, I think it was a published project. Some of the other some of the other lyrics projects I've done, big projects previously, where the actual sentence circles overlapped from the start, intentionally so. But this time they're not. It's like the Imagination project. These are separate circles entirely, and they're not meant to overlap. So it does mean I have some thoughts about how I need to fill out that gap. And as I said earlier, one of the things I definitely intend to do is try to sprout out some writing that go all the way to the edges and take up some space there. Grubbifreyan 2 is excellent at taking up space everywhere it can. So that was definitely something I wanted to do. But otherwise, what I can do and could have done if I had different things I needed to make fit, what I could have done was to simply take some extras and just put it on there. Like I could maybe fill out a corner of the screen with my name. I could fill out the title of the song. I could put the artist on. There are some different meta information I could provide onto the project itself if I needed to fill out some space. And eventually, I actually did put the title into the actual script itself. I did that not using any Gallifreyan script. I just did it in English because at that point I felt like doing that in, I don't know, Dark Affair or something would have been a bit on the nose. So, but I am thinking about some of the blank spaces I have left and trying to put my lines, put my letters, put my dots where they do the most good in those terms. Now we are back with the line work for Spinner. These are all marked in red for my sanity because there's a lot of very specific endpoints that need to be met, both inside and out, in order to make this work the way it's supposed to work. And once you get the hang of it's fine. But maybe start off your first project with a little bit of a smaller sentence, shall we say, or at least a little bit less compact, because that's a tendency I have to have. Whenever I do stuff, I don't tend to do trial runs first. I just jump straight into it. But it worked out in the end after several iterations, which I actually think I caught on camera later on. But at this stage, Spinner is pretty much done. And I like the effect of sort of wavy circles inside circles inside circles. I think it worked out. Now at this point, even though I'm making some adjustments to the thicknesses here, on the grander scale, thicknesses are not something I have played into at this point yet. Thicknesses are sort of the last thing I do because it ties into the effects of different power strokes and different trims and some of the things I can do with lines that include tapering and stuff like that. All of those visual appearances that don't actually change the letters are some of the last things I do. So I'm generally not considering thicknesses yet. And at this scale, with a text of this size, it's usually not important how each and every single letter looks, because the bigger the project is, the smaller and less meaningful each letter is, visually speaking. So at this point, with a text of this size, it's actually usually, at least I found, more nice to look at if everything is sort of the same. Like you almost want some homogeneity at this point, just because everything is so small in comparison to the rest. So I'm keeping everything mostly at a nice 0.3 millimeter thickness. And at this point, I think we're almost done with the line work, which is, as usual, the most tedious part of Sherman. especially when you have bigger projects to consider, because there's a lot of lines. Now, I mentioned doing some iterations on this, and this is what you're seeing right now. First off, I'm proofreading this for a second time, I think, and then I am trying to see if I can make a less busy version of that, because there was a lot of overlapping lines that turned into a lot of weavy lines with the Celtic knot effect. And at this point, I'm trying to see if I can do away with the superfluous line work. So I'm just keeping the shapes that I actually need to write. It's sort of minimalistic in a way, trying to see if I can make some more consistent cuts without all the interruptions. So fewer cuts, more continuous lines, and overall just removing some of the small itty bitty pieces. So that's what you're seeing me do right now. Same effect overall. We still get the same wavy composition. It's just a bit less busy. And I really like it, but I ended up not going with it just because, I don't know, the first iteration felt like it just felt bigger in a way, if that makes sense. And I liked that, so I kept the first iteration in, even though I can totally see the appeal of doing a more minimalistic version of that with fewer lines and less, a more clean structure essentially. Now, this is proofread number one. I'm just, for the third time now, going through all the scripts and looking at them and checking if I can spot anything. At this point, I'm also looking for glitches, visual glitches with the extra nodes that might appear at sharp corners for the meter. I'm looking through to see if I've missed any color related stuff. There's some color codings left here and there, and I've marked every sentence in green, and now I'm going around and removing those to see how far I've gone. Because at this point, remember, again, there might have been 1 or 2 weeks in between me returning to this project, so I needed the color codes to remember where I was and what I was doing. I've also left notes just wherever I stopped on the project to remind myself of, hey, this is what you were doing, this is what we were planning on doing, get to it. So there's that, and I did catch some lines here and there. As I said, this is probably one of the most error-filled projects I've done in a long time, just because I think I've been too distracted by all the new stuff, and just for the fact that I've been on and off and on and off for so long. So I hope I caught everything. Some scripts were easier than others, but I did catch a lot, so I hope I got at least most of it. And having looked through all that and finding it pretty nice, this is the third proofread of this, and I think it's going to be my last. So having done that, and mind, this is only doing the third proofreading, I totally figured out that I missed a line, because for the second to last verse, there is an extra bit of chorus. Instead of one repeating line, there's two repeating lines. And so I had to quickly figure out a way to get that in there without, messing up the whole structure. So what I did was I pulled out Artbyboredom, which is amazing for smaller scale, linear style text. I just needed one line, and I needed it to be, well, unfurled, and I didn't want to deal with any line work, because at this point I'm tired of line work, frankly. And I made a little piece of Artbyboredom. So I've done similar workflows before with both this and Dark Affair, and actually Shermans as well. The idea here is I use a very similar size for every letter, and I reuse all the same assets so that it has a clean structure all the way through that looks identical all the way. And having done that, I just made an arc and put those letters on the arc and just made it curl around the verse that it follows. So I think I got away with that pretty easily, and it also added another script, unexplained, unexpected, so that was nice as well. And so now we come to the last script, which is Grubbifreyan 2. And I think everyone caught a little glimpse of what I did there before I started writing. I put 2 spirals on the center, and now I'm filling out the space not taken by the blue one, because I have a cunning plan to repeat part of the actual letters, because the last piece of text here is one line repeated twice. So by doing what you just saw me do there, I essentially just write some text, make sure it doesn't overlap with its twin, and then I essentially mirror it 180 degrees and make a second twist that just follows in the blue path. And I think that was pretty clever, and I think it looked great. It's actually been on my mind to do a project like this for a while, and I still intend to do that, but in a very different visual style than this. This just saved me some work, but I have another plan to do a similar sort of thing with the centerpiece being, well, something else. But at this point, I've written everything I can by mirroring, so now I need to make some individual choices to fill out different areas. So I want one branch to go up and fill some of the 1 and 2 o'clock spaces, mostly the 1 o'clock space above the third verse, and the other branch I want to go down and fill out about the 5 o'clock space, thereabouts, the bottom. And that's what you're seeing me doing right now. I'm just writing my text here and sort of trying to plan ahead. How much is this going to take up? Where can I lead these letters? And where do I need to split them up in order to keep everything concise? Now, the workflow for this in particular struck me as being a bit weird. I don't know if it's the size of the project, the amount of thinking that Inkscape had to do, because there's a lot of stuff on screen, and it wasn't as responsive as it normally would be. But I found that the Grubbifreyan workflow here was way worse than usual. It took a lot of time to write every letter, and it took a lot of time to tweak the branches and the stems. It just felt like the smoothing wasn't right, even though I tried a bunch of different stuff. The amount of smoothing that usually is more than enough to get my necessary line work just didn't cut it here. And so I had to do a lot of extra tweaking and a lot of post-processing of every single line in Grubbifreyan 2 to get to where I needed to go. I don't know why, but I think it added at least an extra hour of work, just because for some reason everything was not as smooth as it was supposed to be. But I did get it in the end, and got all the letters and the stems going. You can see now I'm filling out the bottom part of the screen, and I'm periodically having to check in with the other scripts to see how much space I have and try to be clever about how many lines I need to cross and how I incorporate those lines or not, because stray lines in Grubbifreyan are a little bit different than most other scripts in that you can't actually influence any letter with some stray lines, but it's supposed to be dashed lines when they're just decorative, and these aren't, for good reason. So I need to be careful about how I approach those lines from different scripts and how they interact with Grubbifreyan. Having said that, now it's actually time to look at the overall composition because everything is written now. Everything is taking up the space it needs to take up. And at this point, I can look at the different thicknesses, I can look at the effects, I can tweak some of the double letters that you saw there that I couldn't have tweaked prior to this because it's only at this point that I'm starting to turn things into paths. And I put in there the title of the song, and I did that to remind myself that I might decide to do that later on. So at this point, I'm not certain yet, but I think I want to take up that space with the title, which is nice, out of the way of the main text. You're not going to be confused about the presence of the text, and you're not going to be confused about how it fits into the rest of the lines. Especially because at this point I'm not sure whether or not I want to write it in a script or whether I just want to write it in plain English. And yeah, I did put a little watermark in there. It just felt like I had to put something in the center, and I mean that was as good as anything I could come up with on short notice. So yes, I did put the my little watermark in there. Something I always have to do whenever I decide to do some actual text is I need to figure out if there is a font that really works for this. And I don't have any sophisticated approach. I just make a copy of it and just go through all the fonts and the previews until I find something that clicks. And I did do that. And now it is time for one last proofread. You saw me speed through right there. So now we get to the exciting part, which is always the last part, sadly, which is the coloring. And I had no plans for this, other than the fact that I knew that I wanted the text to be one thing and some of the decoration, outer master circles to be something else. So that's why I put it together in two groups, one with the text and the other the background. And I started off with some, I don't know if gold is the right word, some brown, yellowish text. I mean, you could say it's gold, but I tried consciously here to go for some more brass or bronze looks. Um, and to contrast this, I made some dark blue backgrounds. And I feel like I got away with that pretty well. It took a lot of tweaks to find the amount of brown, bronze-ish that I wanted because I didn't want it to really, I didn't want it to be too much, essentially. So I'm trying to highlight the text a little bit. I'm trying to make some shiny text in general, and then I just want everything to be readable. So checking the contrasts and checking the color schemes, and I had a lot of fun with this. But in the end, there's not a lot to it. There's no crazy gradients. There's no mesh gradients. There's no clouds or covers or dust or smoke or anything like that. It's kept pretty simple, and I think it's all the better for it. So at this point, I'm done with the project. I've proofread it all I can, and at this point, I'm not gonna catch any more errors. At this point, it would just be I would need some fresh eyes on this, frankly. So that's what I did, and it's done. It's been over 4 months, probably closer to 5. It was a long journey, but I made it, and here it is, and it's absolutely worth a listen to. If you find the song by the Longest Johns, it's absolutely worth a listen to. I'm really happy with this project, and having done this now, I'm going to return to some of the smaller projects for a while because I need a break, frankly. So, yeah, but this is the project. Thank you for watching.